Assalamu alaikum. This is Dr.Arwa. Today we are going to discuss the basic physiology of motor function of nervous system. By the end of this lecture, you have to know the define of motor tracts, define the parts of motor tracts, and define the parts of upper motor units tracts, such as extrapyramidal and pyramidal tracts, and to know what exactly the lower motor neuron tracts are. Motor tracts are divided into two main parts. The first part is the upper motor neuron tracts, as a short UMN. The second part is the lower motor neuron tracts, which is called as a short LMN. What are motor neuron tracts? Motor tracts are mainly the tracts that's responsible for transmitting the motor commands in response to sensory information. And these commands are delivered by two main systems. The first system, which is called the somatic nervous system, which is responsible for the direction of the voluntary contraction, that directs the contraction of skeletal muscles. The second system, autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for the direction for involuntary contraction, direct the activity of bulk system, such as glands, smooth muscles, and cardiac muscles. Upper motor neuron tracts contains two main parts. The first part is the extrapyramidal system, and this system, it's given that name, the extra, to distinguish this system from other tracts that traveling through the pyramids of a part in the central nervous system called medulla oblongata. The extrapyramidal system, it's also called the subconscious system because it has a main function controlling the subconscious regulation actions such as balance, muscle tone, eye, hand, and upper limb position. The other important part in the upper motor neuron tract is the pyramidal tract that's traveling through the pyramids of medulla oblongata and responsible for innervating motor neuron of the spinal cord or brain stem. The extrapyramidal system, or what's called subconscious tracts, consists of four tracts. Vestibulospinal tracts, from its given name, is the tracts that started from the vestibular region in the spinal cord, in the brain, down to the lower part of the central nervous system that's called spinal cord. For this reason, it's called a vestibulospinal tract. Ectecticospinal tracts. It's tracts that started in the upper central nervous system in the tecticum region in the brain down to the spinal cord. And for this reason, it's called the tecticospinal tract. The reticulospinal tracts, again, it started from the upper region in the central nervous system in the reticular information system down to the lower region in the central nervous system to the spinal cord. For this reason, it's called the reticulospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract, again, the same that started in the brain down to the spinal. For this reason, it's called rubrospinal tracts. These tracts are also called descending motor tracts because it's starting from the upper region in the central nervous system in the brain down to the lower region in the central nervous system of the spinal cord. Vestibulospinal tracts are mainly tracts that are responsible for sending information from the inner ear to monitor position of the head. Ecticospinal tracts are mainly tracts that are responsible for sending information to the head, neck, and upper limbs in response to bright and sudden movements and loud noises. This tract is divided into two main parts. The first part, called the superior one, which is responsible for receiving visual information, while the other one is called inferior colliculi, that's responsible for receiving auditory information. The reticulospinal tract is mainly responsible for sending information that causing eye movement and activate respiratory muscles. Rubrospinal tract, a tract that's responsible for sending information to the flexor and extensor muscles. Now, let us talk about the pyramidal tract, the second part of the upper motor neuron tract. The pyramidal tract includes both important tracts. The first tract called cortico-papular tract, while the other is called corticospinal tract. These tracts are aggregations of efferent nerve fibers from upper motor neurons, traveling from cerebral cortex and terminate in the brain stem, that so-called cortico-papular tract, or terminates in the spinal cord, that's called corticospinal tract. And these tracts are involved in controlling of motor functions of body. Now, the corticopulbar tract is responsible for conducting the impulses from the brain to the cranial nerves, and these nerves that controlling the muscles of the face and neck, which is involve facial expression, mastication, swallowing, and other functions. The corticospinal tract conducting the impulses from the brain down to the spinal cord. It's made of two main parts. The first part is called lateral, the second part is called anterior tract. Now, the majority of fibers of corticospinal tract crosses over in the medulla oblongata. And the term here, crossover, means that the left side of the brain is controlling the right side of the body, and the right side of the brain is controlling the left side of the body. And this resulting in muscle being controlled by opposite side of the brain. The corticospinal tracts are also contains a very important cells, which is the largest cells in the pyramidal cells, called Pitts cells, that's located in the primary motor cortex. The corticospinal tracts, when descending from internal capsule to the brainstem, it converges to a point from a multiple directions, that's giving the impression of an inverted pyramid. The myelination, what's called a myelination of pyramidal fibers, it's incomplete at birth, and it gradually progresses in cranio-caudal direction, and thereby progressively gaining functionality. And most of the myelination of the pyramidal fibers is complete by 2 years of age, and thereafter it progresses very slowly in cranio-caudal direction up to 12 years of age. This depicted picture is to show you the tracts of the pyramidal and extrapyramidal tract, starting from the cerebral cortex down to the medulla oblongata. Again, there is what's called, as we have discussed previously, corticopulbar tract that's responsible for the sending information from the upper brain down to the cranial or what's called motor nuclei of cranial nerves. Now the other tract from the cerebral cortex down to the medulla oblongata that's make a shape of inverted pyramid and down to the spinal cord, to the lateral side of the spinal cord, is the lateral corticospinal tract. And the other one that's contacting the impulses from the cerebral cortex down to the medulla oblongata, down to the anterior portion of the spinal cord. It's called the anterior corticospinal tract. Again, if you want to discuss or to know the relation of the position of what's called the extrapyramidal tract to the pyramidal tract, again we can see that in a cross section of the spinal cord. Now, in the cross-section of the spinal cord at the lateral side, we can see the retrospinal tract, which is a tract of the extrapyramidal tract that's exactly situated laterally to what's so-called the lateral corticospinal tract, which is a very important tract in the pyramidal one. On the anterior portion of the spinal cord, we can see the other three tracts of the extrapyramidal tract, which are the vestibulospinal tract and reticulospinal tract and the tacticospinal tract. Again, they are situated anteriorly to the anterior cortical spinal tract, which is another important tract in the pyramidal tract. Now let us move to talk about the lower motor neuron. At the beginning, what are the lower motor neuron? The lower motor neuron, they are neurons that innervate the skeletal muscle fibers, and they function as the final common pathway. The final link between the central nervous system and the skeletal muscles are the lower motor neuron. All the voluntary movements depends upon the excitation of the lower motor neuron by upper motor neuron. Where they come from? They're mainly coming from the spinal cord, and these are our motor component of the cranial nerve nuclei in the brain stem, which cranial nerves that innervates the skeletal muscle that's associated with the movements of eyes, tongue, chewing, swallowing, and vocalizing. If we want to classify the lower motor neuron, we have two main classifications. The first classification is based type on muscle fibers that they innervate. The first one called alpha motor neuron that innervates what's called extrafusal muscle fibers, the most numerous type of the muscle fiber and involved in muscle contraction, as exactly seen here. Extrafusal fibers. Now, the other classification is the gamma motor neuron, innervates intramuscle fibers. Now, the intramuscle fibers, or what's called intrafusal muscle fibers, together with the sensory afferents, also called or composes a very important part in the muscle, which is muscle spindle, that's responsible mainly for the stretch reflex. And these are part of the system for sensing body position, or what's called proprioception, or the sense of the body position. By this slide, we end our today lecture, which is the basic physiology of motor unit. بتمنى السلامة للجميع، والشيء اللي بدنا نحكيه ضروري إنه بالنسبة للامتحان، الامتحان ما أنتم مطالبين فيه، فقط هو المكتوب على السلايد. وشكرا للاستماع، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.